Welcome back to Esther's Breeze, where we sit back, chat, and shoot the breeze. We are in season 2, and this is episode 7. Thank you so much for joining us. Your constant love and support is so appreciated. A huge thank you to Jenny DeHame from PAX Management, to my mentor and good friend, Mr. Robert D'Alessio, to my background techie, Mr. Fernando Renzo, to publicist extraordinaire, Mr. Steve Joyner, and to all of you once again for joining us. Esther's Breeze is available on the Esther's Breeze YouTube channel, on Bobby Short Short's YouTube channel, and on Esther Brzezinski's profile page on Facebook. We also extract the audio, and we are available on all streaming platforms, and including Spotify, Apple Podcast, etc. I am so excited for today's guest. We just had a nice chat backstage. Tonight, we will be speaking to Jennifer Vaughn. Jennifer Vaughn is an award-winning, best-selling author and Emmy-nominated, multiple award-winning television news anchor for ABC affiliate in New Hampshire. With over 2 decades of experience in the news industry, she has written 6 books, 4 fiction and 2 narrative nonfiction, and her latest book is titled Made in Hollywood, The Scott Morrow Story, an extensive look into the life of an A-list child star from the 50s and 60s, and that would be Scotty or Scott Morrow. His very first feature film for MGM was Between Heaven and Hell in 1956, followed by Red Sundown, which paved the way for 20th Century Fox Pictures to cast him in the role of Joey Cross in the epic production of Peyton Place. This was followed by Affair to Remember in 1957 for the same studio, and many, many more. He was also a very dear friend of the iconic actress Marilyn Monroe. All this information and so much more is described in detail in Jennifer Vaughn's new book. And we now have a trailer about that book to show you. How are you? Thank you so much for being here.
Hi there. It's wonderful to see you. Thank you so much for having me on. Such a pleasure.
It's absolutely our pleasure as well. Fernando liked it so much he wanted to play it again.
I don't blame him.
It's a great trailer, by the way. And I want you to know that I bought the book today.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
I will be putting the link. It's on my Facebook description already, and I will be doing it for both YouTube channels, so people will be able to buy it. Whether it's in US or Canada. So there's different links for either or. So I just want you to know that. I'm so excited. I can't wait to read it. But first, I want to know a little bit about yourself, your career. How did you get into newscasting? What prompted you to get into that particular profession?
So I graduated from college with an English degree and thought, okay, what am I going to do with this? And when I was a kid, I wrote to some local news anchors in my area. I grew up south of Boston, Massachusetts, and they both wrote back to me, and they were women. And I thought, wow, I love that. I think that's great. I would love telling stories all day and going to exciting places and sharing the news of our communities and of our state and of our country and world. So it was a thought of mine. And then when I got out of college, I did what a lot of kids do, is I waitress for a bit. And I overheard somebody, a woman at a table, discussing with her dinner date, her job, her day. And she was in radio, and she was in radio news. So when she was done eating, I didn't want to intrude too much on her time because I knew I was about to. But I went up and introduced myself and asked, how did you get into what you're doing, your profession, because I'm very curious and interested about doing it myself. So she granted me a really unique, wonderful opportunity. She allowed me to come down to her news station down in Providence, Rhode Island, and I did an internship down there, which she later told me I never do that. But because you were polite and persistent, I said, okay, I'll give her a shot. So I spent some time in radio learning how to use your voice properly, which, as you know, is a big part of being in the broadcast industry. How do you write news articles for radio, for TV? They're very different from what you would write for print, say. And how do you do all of these things while traveling to a scene? And how do you make sources? And how do you use those sources to share pertinent information? How do you make sure that you're entrusted by the community that you serve? So basically the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 steps of how to get into this business. She was pivotal in all of those ways. And from there, I graduated to my own job in radio at a nearby town, near my hometown, and spent some time doing that. Still kept the waitressing job because in the very beginning of a lot of industries, and definitely news is one of them, you don't make a lot of money. So I had to work multiple jobs at the same time, and then just kept jumping. So eventually I took a job in New Hampshire, and I have been there ever since. It's one of those positions where it's a wonderful state to live in. Right. We have the presidential primary every 4 years, so there's never a dull moment. And I was able to raise my kids up here in New Hampshire in a nice, peaceful, private way. No regrets. There were opportunities to go elsewhere, to bigger markets and to networks, and it just never seemed to work out. So I know that I'm where I was supposed to be.
And so the station that you're working in right now is an ABC affiliate, is that
correct? Yes, so it's the ABC affiliate for New Hampshire. We have a brand new 4 p.m. show that we just launched a week ago. I anchor that and our 6 o'clock news. And there's a wonderful, they call it New Hampshire Chronicle. It's a wonderful story that showcases people and places and unique sides of the state. Nice. Every now and again, I can contribute to that too. And that I love that because you can go long format. You can extend your interviews with people. You can allow beautiful video to come in and color your story, that's my favorite part of TV. Joining words with images and video and leaving that sort of imprint on your viewers is such a way to ground somebody in a story, to make it memorable. And it remains my favorite part of being able to deliver the good side of news, if you'll indulge me that. Right. The storytelling part of news, because day to day, we really can't do that. We are beholden to the news of the day and the items of the day. And most often that's not always good, unfortunately. So to tell great stories with true to life characters, beautiful video, I love that part of it.
And there's also the aspect of writing, like you described earlier. Yes. So do you believe that that part of your job led you to want to write novels to begin with and then just, biographies afterwards?
I do 100% think that one leads into the next naturally. It's the natural next step. Particularly, I grew up reading everything I could devour. And that includes from the time I was 9, 10, and 11, whatever my mom was reading. And she happened to leave on her nightstand, I would grab. And I'm talking everything. I'm talking Sidney Sheldon and Jackie Collins, and Patterson and Stephen King and anybody that I could get my hands on. And what I admire now, all these years later, is that my mom never scolded me for doing that or told me, no, you can't. You shouldn't be reading that. She allowed me to grab whatever I wanted to and then come to her if I had any questions. And normally I didn't. I'd figure it out on my own. But, the being allowed to sort of enter into adulthood, at least as it relates to books and the written word, I think it just expanded my mind even at a younger age. So whenever I read, I see it. I see it come to life in my head, which is what makes a really good book stand out. When you can visualize the characters long after you've shut the last page, and that sticks with you. So naturally, I wanted to be able to do that. So I gave it a go, and here I am 6 books later with a 7th coming out next month.
And I was going to ask you about that as well. So, what led you to eventually write the book that we want to speak about tonight, Made in Hollywood, the Scott Morrow story? What led you to meet the gentleman and write his life story or his story up to now?
It's always a roundabout story, isn't it?
Yeah.
So, and it's a small world. In 2019, I wrote my first narrative nonfiction, which is a story based on real life, real people, real events, with a gentleman from New Hampshire who reached out to me, and we have mutual friends, and we somewhat knew each other. And he had this extraordinary life story, but a lot of people say they do. So, of course, I granted him time. Please come over. Let's talk about this. Let's see if this, if I can help you. So I spent about 4 hours with him during our first meeting, and we discussed the ins and outs of what I found to be the most extraordinary life story I had ever heard. So that became my 2019 book, Shadow Kid. And after Shadow Kid released, he came back to me and said, listen, I have a friend, as the world is small sometimes, and particularly when you have West Coast or Hollywood connections, which these two gentlemen did. And he's really interested in telling his own life story. And would you be interested in meeting with him? To which I said, okay, if it's coming from you, absolutely. And he said, well, he was a child actor back in the 50s and 60s, and you might know him most from the movie Peyton Place. So then my antenna went up because, of course, who doesn't know about the movie Peyton Place? So I then started to speak with Scott, and we had many conversations. And I think I sent a fake chapter 1 over just to say, this is how I would begin your story. And we decided that we were going to give this a go too. So then that became Made in Hollywood. And how we did this was basically with Scott, it was very intense, because think of every picture. There's a ton of pictures included in the book Made in Hollywood, but there's also movies for me that perhaps I hadn't heard, because I'm not from his generation, hadn't necessarily watched. So there was a lot of time that I spent going through, finding his old roles and all of these old sitcoms, or there's the book Made in Hollywood with the cover. And that's one of his best headshots, and shot by a very prolific headshot photographer back in the day, very well known.
How old is he in this particular shot?
How old is he? I'd say 7.
Okay.
7 or so. And these are some of the pictures from his personal collection of just some of the major productions that he was in. And then this is perhaps his most iconic role of all time, which was as Joey Cross opposite Hope Lang. And you can see that in this picture too. So that was from 20th Century Fox. The date is 1957, but this was shot, of course, 1956. And it is, you talk about a pressure cooker of a film, a pressure cooker of a casting process, and then think of a little boy right smack dab in the middle of it. So once we kind of felt each other out a bit and started getting to work on this, I learned not just about the acting, but about the little boy that he was and who he came from. And that really sold me on writing this book. His family, their adventures, who he was as a kid and then as a young man who served our country in the Air Force during the Vietnam War era, and who he became, the losses he endured, the soaring success he achieved as a young person, and then pivoted into an equally successful photography career as an adult, one that he still does today. So he became not just the subject of a book that I wrote, but he remains a very dear friend.
And we talked earlier backstage about the fact that he was able to transition from one successful career to another successful career as an adult, and in fact did not experience all the sort of horrid stories we hear of child actors. So it is in fact a positive story. So, that's really nice to hear, because that doesn't happen very often.
It doesn't. And doesn't it seem like we talk more about the ones that don't end well, rather than focus and celebrate the ones that do? And the life of Scott Morrow is a successful one, in which he was able to achieve, the highest level of success in Hollywood as a little boy, and then the highest success in a whole realm of photography as an adult. There's a ton of hard work behind the scenes. There's loss, there's tragedy that he endured, but even every step of the way, he maintained his integrity and his focus, and he remained a really, really good man, and kind of walked the straight and narrow, but had a wonderful life.
So let's talk a little bit about how he started out and how involved his mother was in his career, and how his brother Brad was also a child actor. Let's talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So he was born in Chicago. His big brother, Brad, was born in Chicago. His mom and dad, Toby and Les Mora, are from Chicago originally. But Toby right away, think a woman of the 40s and 50s, and here she was with this little son, her firstborn, Brad, started to notice a few things about him, some characteristics about him that were intriguing to her. He could move really well. His dad was a dancer. He could move like his dad. He was speaking a lot. He was he had excellent facial control and expressions, and he was quite a little character. So back in the day, there was some vaudeville type productions, local productions, and Brad entered that world. And not too long after he entered it, he was picked up. There was a gentleman who came to one of the shows and noticed Brad right away and said, "Listen, I'm from Hollywood. I'm from California. I'm interested in your boy." But Toby, being the forward thinker, visionary that she was, not just a mom, but someone who was thinking bigger, thought, okay, what might that mean for my son? What might that mean for my family? So she decided that in order to really pursue something like this, she needed to get out to where the action was happening, which is Los Angeles, which is California. So by the time we start discussing her presence in the boy's life right out of the gate, because she basically did control the move. She got to California, stepped off the train, and gave birth to Scott.
Oh my goodness.
To little Scotty. So he was already positioned, as was his brother, at the age of 4, to really take this industry by storm. So they landed an agent. That was a process too. To find an agent, particularly a good one back then, not a lot of them represented children. And Toby would only settle for the best for her boys. So she settled upon the agent. His name was Frank Ryan. He wasn't her first choice, but he became the best choice. So right away, they started working on some roles for Brad, the older brother. And he was in Annie, Get Your Gun as a little boy. And Scotty at that point was starting to listen to his brother, memorize his brother's lines, repeat tunes that his brother was singing. And Toby would bring him along to shoots. So he was in the back of the studio as Brad was shooting Annie, Get Your Gun with Betty Hutton, and a big role. He was little Jake. So Scotty was seeing these big stars and these big productions and these big cameras and movie magic from the time that he was 2 and 3 years old. So an interesting, almost something that almost clicked but didn't for both boys was back in the day, there was something known as Lux soap. So this was a big brand. And they were looking to shoot a commercial with a young actress, this up and comer. And they needed a child. And at this point, Toby brought both boys. So they auditioned for the role of what would eventually go to 2 twin girls, opposite Marilyn Monroe.
Oh my goodness.
So it was the boy's first brush with her, and someone who later became a dear friend of Scotty's. He looked upon her as a big sister, and Marilyn, looked upon Toby as a wise older confidant, and she shared with her turmoil, her secrets. But they had a lot of fun together. A lot of stories within the book are times shared between Marilyn and Scotty on the set of 20th Century Fox. They were lot mates. So his trailer was set up right next to her trailer by virtue of their last name. They went by alphabetical order.
Right, Morrow, Monroe. Right.
Yes. So a funny story that Scott, that we talk about in the book too, but he always got a kick, even as he tells me this all these years later. So he did shoot a movie years ago. Both he and Brad were both in this movie with Robert Wagner. And they didn't have big parts. In fact, Toby was very proud about a particular scene that they both did that it ended up getting cut. But they shot this movie, Between Heaven and Hell. And later, Robert Wagner would moan and groan about the proximity that Scotty had to Marilyn Monroe on the lot, saying that it was a privilege wasted on a kid.
That's hilarious.
So all of these rumors would get back. Well, Robert Wagner's not very happy about the fact that you're right next door to Marilyn Monroe. But it was a very innocent relationship. It was very sweet and tender. Marilyn was very, very fond of kids, and she was very gentle with children. And they would share a lot of time together eating drumstick ice cream cones. And he would spend time in her trailer with her, and knew that Nivea skin cream was her favorite because it was on every shelf around the trailer
as well.
Yes. So the stories are very endearing, and they're very sweet, and they're very genuine. And I think if Marilyn were still here to share her memories, she would recount them as the same.
Did they ever get a chance to act together?
So Brad did Monkey Business, I believe. Not a huge, pivotal role, but he was on the same set and had the same affection toward Marilyn. But he didn't have quite the depth of relationship that Scotty did, given the virtue of their trailers. However, at the tail end of Scotty's career, as he was becoming a young man, 16, 17 years old, that was unfortunately the time in which Marilyn was experiencing her very steep decline.
Right.
But she had established her own production company, Marilyn Monroe Productions, and she reached out to Frank. And at this point in her career, she was still attached to 20th Century Fox, but she was teetering on the edge. And Toby in particular was very, very wary of anything linked to Marilyn at that point. It was just after, the President Kennedy, Happy Birthday, Mr. President debacle.
Right. Bit of a spectacle.
Yes, it was a spectacle. She had become a spectacle. There were all sorts of rumors about, drug and alcohol dependency going on. And honestly, the film heads had enough of it. There were antics going on that they were tired of putting up with. And she had burned a lot of bridges at that point. But she had specifically reached out to Frank about Scotty, and she proposed a trilogy that she was currently hiring screenwriters for, and she was working to cast it. And this was to be a trilogy, and she needed a particular actor to play what might be her nephew. So she would appear in at least one of the movies of this trilogy. And she specifically reached out to Frank, inquiring about Scotty's availability. And it's one of the more poignant chapters in the book. Towards the end of the book, as he pivots into manhood and into the military and out of being a child actor, in which his mom receives word of this conversation, because Frank, of course, reached out to her in high excitement, thinking that anybody would be thrilled to be attached to anything Marilyn was putting together, regardless of her status, her current status. But Toby was too wise for that. And she was protective enough of Scotty at that point to want him to leave the industry at the top of his game. And she was concerned that anything that he was attached to involving Marilyn, who was precarious at best, would not be great for him. So it's a very emotional chapter that describes that conversation, with Toby letting Scotty know of Marilyn's interest, Scotty having the immediate juvenile, affectionate reaction, thinking, I want anything to do with Marilyn. I'm honored that she would think of me as an adult, 16, 17 years old, rather than a little kid, and want me in her own production. So there was that pride, that a young man feels after knowing somebody for so long. And then very shortly thereafter, Marilyn was gone. So Toby, in her own way, her sort of prescient way of all knowing, understood that perhaps this was more pie in the sky, or Marilyn fantasizing about something that might never happen. And it ended up never happening, as we know.
Yeah, it's so very sad. And you spoke earlier about the fact that she did, in fact, adore children, would visit a particular hospital
Yeah.
to see some of the children who were ill, and in fact went to visit Scott in the hospital because in the trailer that we showed, which I don't have the photo from the book itself, there's a picture of Marilyn leaning over on a hospital
Yeah.
bed, sort of stroking Scott's face, and very sweet.
Very sweet and genuine.
Yeah.
They were supposed to have they had a screen test prepped. So
Oh,
20th Century Fox had brought them both together for this pre-scheduled screen test. I'm not sure what project, and Scotty doesn't remember either. But there was some project out there that they were going to at least put them together for a screen test. And Scotty grew unexpectedly sick, and his mom and dad brought him into the hospital for something he thinks may be a bad case of tonsillitis. He doesn't even remember, but he was there for maybe a day or so. And Marilyn got word of that and stopped by, as she often did. There was a wing over, it's now Cedars-Sinai in Los Angeles. It had a different name back then.
right.
But Marilyn contributed a ton of money to help support, sick children and the development of a particular wing. And she was a visitor there a lot. She came to see the kids, but when she got word that Scotty was there, she went right over in that beautiful black dress and leaned over and stroked his head. And he says, I thought at first it might be a fever dream, but then there was a picture to prove it happened, that she was really there. But that's another part of who she was too, the stuff behind the scenes that nobody heard about. And that's what Marilyn was most famous for too, for those who genuinely loved her, not just as the icon, but, as in Scotty's case, like a big sister.
And apparently there's a story from the film The Heart is a Rebel where she actually, and I actually have a photo. Oh, yeah, there it is. Where she actually was friends with
Ethel Waters.
Right, Ethel.
Yeah.
Right. And she surprised everyone. And yeah, like nobody knows that about her. Her kindness, her sweetness, her, like I said earlier, her love of children, and what an incredible, loyal and generous friend that she was. So
It's a very sweet story from that movie, which Scotty loved to shoot. He adored Ethel Waters. He adored her. And the only thing he didn't like about shooting The Heart is a Rebel is that he played a very sick little boy. So everything he shot for the entire length of that movie was him in pajamas in a bed. So he didn't love that part of it. And it was coming off another movie that he had also shot as a sick little boy, The Cosmic Man, which was a very successful sci-fi movie that he was also in, and also played a debilitated little boy. So he said that he loved both movies, but the only part he didn't love was that he was sick in both. But when he was shooting The Heart is a Rebel, he loved Ethel. And he said after one particular day, there was a break. They were breaking for lunch, and Toby came in, and he was getting changed out of his pajamas. They were going to go get something to eat. And he said it was just all of a sudden chaos on set. Everybody was screaming and laughing. And he was like, "Mom, what's going on?" And she said, "Oh, Marilyn just showed up." He's like, "Oh, well, what's she doing here?" So she had arranged to come on set with a big box of beautiful roses and scoop up her dear friend Ethel and take her out for lunch on her birthday. It was a surprise. Ethel certainly didn't expect it, but Marilyn had arranged for, hush, hush, I'm going to come in and I'm going to surprise Ethel and we're going to go off for her birthday. So they ended up at the same restaurant, but Scott and Toby sat in the way back, whereas Ethel and Marilyn sat, at the front where she would oftentimes go with all of her superstar celebrity Hollywood movie star friends.
So I understand even to this day he often speaks on the I think the anniversary.
Yes.
Yeah.
So because you think of the decades that have passed, and think of those who have been lost alongside Marilyn, who would know her from personal stories. And it's getting to be fewer and fewer and further in between. And Scott remains as somebody who is personally connected to Marilyn and can personally speak of who she was beyond the icon.
Right.
So he's often invited for remembrances, commemorations. He'll speak at sometimes the studio lots, and he's put together videos of all of his private pictures, collages. He's excellent with that now, given, he's the prolific photographer.
Right.
And he's celebrated as someone who's a bit of an expert on her. But consider that all he's really doing is sharing stories of knowing her as a child. And that's what's so special about that, because it shows more of who she really was. If you take away all of the Hollywood trappings and all of the glitz and glam that everybody knew and adored her for, he doesn't care. He never cared about any of that. He just cared about the fun girl who never wore makeup and her hair was in rollers and would have ice cream dripping down their arms as they sat together and laughed outside of their trailers, and talked about this wild Hollywood world that they were both in, and how Toby became like a mom almost to Marilyn too, who could dole out advice and listen to her problems and try to help her along. And that's what he remembers her for. And that is the very special connection that remains within him, that he will share, occasionally and in Made in Hollywood today, to this day. And she's been gone for so long. So a connection like that is just, it's a really unique, special link.
It's a great story and indeed a great friendship. So I want to talk a little bit about Peyton Place, because I know there was a lot of drama. Even getting the part, apparently he went through like 10 different auditions. Like, tell us about the process of getting that part and what happened throughout the filming.
So by then, Scotty was really building a name for himself as a dependable, versatile child actor. And he had been doing Westerns, and he had been doing sitcoms and weekly shows and live entertainment. So he was well known at that point, still building his resume, but well known. So he was also under a 3-picture contract deal with 20th Century Fox, which means that they could plug him into whatever production they needed him for, or they can call him in for a potential project, but along with all of the other child actors that they want to see for that potential role. So it was very secretive. They didn't know a whole lot about it. And there were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 sessions that Scotty had to appear for. He had to read a couple of times. He would be given lines as you showed up. So not the kind of lines that nowadays can be emailed over to your agent. Your agent can text them over to you. You can look them over for 3 days and then show up for your audition. No. Back then, he had to show up in an office in front of the producer and the director and read a line. Okay, Scotty, we're going to have you read these lines. We've highlighted them in yellow. And you're a little boy named Joey. So he would come in, and he had that sort of mind. We'd call it a photographic memory, right, where you can see something and it imprints in your head. And he was just really lucky to be born that way. So even as a little boy, he could read a few lines and they would stick there pretty well. So for the first couple of times, for audition purposes, he would come in and he was by himself, and he would read for the producer and the director. And he didn't get a lot of feedback back then. It was just, okay, thanks for coming. We'll be in touch with your agent. Bye-bye now. And then 3 days later, 7 days later, 15 days later, the agent would get a call and they'd say they want to see him again. So by the 6th, 7th time that this happened, they finally brought him over to 20th Century Fox for a screen test. And this was opposite a young blonde actor. And she was to play his sister. So her name was Hope Lang at the time. Right. And nobody had really heard of her either. And Scotty just thought she was really pretty. So they read a couple of lines together. And then they left. And then maybe about 4 days later, he got another call. We want to see you again. And this time we want to see you on the lot. So this is a true screen test. So he shows up on the lot. And at this point, he still doesn't know the nature of this movie. He still doesn't know the name of this movie. He doesn't know when it's shooting. He doesn't really know who was attached to it. So he does a real screen test opposite Hope Lang, and who would eventually go on to play his sister, Selena, in the movie. And it goes well. And then they have him do it again, and it goes well. So then eventually, by then, his mom, Toby, is starting to wonder, what kind of hell am I putting my child through? This is horrible. It's endless. We have no idea where we're going. It feels fruitless. Why are we doing this? So that was one of the first times that she checked herself as a mother who's also serving as a momager in this capacity, is, trying to handle her son's career. And she started to question, I don't know, this is too much. Am I hurting him? Am I harming him? And he wasn't an affected child. He was just cool as a cucumber, as they say. And he just rolled through these auditions and these screen tests, and however often they wanted him back, Scotty was game, and he would go back and he would read his lines. And at that point too, he could start to develop more with Hope Lang. He'd known her a couple of times now. They were doing screen tests together. He could feel a chemistry there. So he started to get excited himself about this. And that's when Toby said, he's getting excited, I'm getting excited, this is going to be a huge letdown. But he ended up getting the job. So by then, they found out that Lana Turner, another premier actress of the time, was also attached. And it was to be, the movie account of a best-selling book, Peyton Place. And by then, Toby didn't really know the book, but others had started to hear about the book. And she had a funny run-in with Cary Grant as Scotty was shooting An Affair to Remember. And he said to her, I'm really excited to see this movie, Peyton Place, because have you read the book? and Toby had kind of like googly eyes for Cary Grant at the time. So, yeah. And then once he found out he landed the job, it was bi-coastal. So he was shooting out in Camden, Maine for several weeks. And then they were shooting out in Simi Valley. And then they were shooting on the lot. So this was a pivotal role. This was an extremely mature role with extremely mature subject matters. And here he was, definitely accompanied by his mom, but in playing these roles, with these in the context that they were meant to be played. And again, a totally unaffected young boy. As I wrote Peyton Place, we decided that this was a big deal, and we needed to treat it as such. The audition process was a big deal. Shooting of the movie was a huge deal. The drama on the set between Grace Metalius, who wrote the book, and Lana Turner, and the director and the producer, it was fiery and ego-driven, and yet Scotty played his role to the very best of his ability, and forever is attached to one of the biggest movies of all time.
And apparently there was a lot of issues between the author of the book and the gentleman who wrote the screenplay. And in my research, I found out that she died at a very young age of liver disease. And so there was alcoholism involved. That's very tragic.
Yes. In fact, sometimes Scotty has such a prolific resume that sometimes I keep notes aside that remind me of, times and places and all of that. This was one of my favorite chapters to write when we get into the nitty gritty of the drama attached to Peyton Place, because at the time Grace Metalius had written this book, and it blew the covers off anything that people were used to reading in novel form. It was sexually explosive. It was violent, sexual violence, family violence. It was every sort of, epic underworld topic that you can think of, all served up into this one book and then one movie. And as the author, I understand this. She wanted it to be like her book. But at the time, it really couldn't be, because movies had to pass the censors in order to even be released into the big screen and released to audiences. So the screenwriter, John Michael Hayes, had this enormous task of whittling away some of the fat of the extra that you couldn't get by the censors. And in a book like Peyton Place, that was a lot. So when Grace Metalius sold the rights, and she knew upon selling the rights that she would have no control over the content of the movie. However, they did invite her to be part of the production so that she could see how a movie was made. Just sort of like, oh, hey, and you can come by and watch if you want. But at the time, Grace Metalius was battling alcoholism, and she had her own demons, and she was a confrontational sort. Never to Scotty, because Joey Cross was basically the same in the book as he was in the movie. They didn't alter too much about his character. So Scotty always had, he had memories of her being kind to him, kindish, as in, hello, how are you? Nice to see you. But a lot of that was directed at Hayes, the screenwriter, because what she was watching was basically the boiling down of her red hot, scintillating novel.
Right.
And she didn't like that one bit. So eventually she just stopped coming around. And that's how they handled that. But there was another explosive actress into the mix, and that was Lana Turner, who Scotty was in and around, not just necessarily in scenes with, but experienced her quite a bit. And back in the day, a couple of the funniest stories that he shared with me, and I just find this really entertaining because, think about 1956 and everybody smoked, but they had to clear the air for production value and for the cameras to get, optimal quality. So he said basically they'd bring in these industrial sized fans to clear the scene. And he said most of the smoke was purely from Lana Turner herself. So yeah, he remembers her in sort of comical ways. But there was one very pivotal scene that he had to shoot back in LA, and that was the courtroom scene, which is how the movie ends and how the book ends. And Joey crosses up on the stand being cross-examined by the prosecutor, Lauren Green, the actor, who was also Scotty said, if I ever was to be intimidated by an actor, Lauren Green could have done it. He had this big presence to him and that booming voice.
Absolutely.
And, he's playing this role that's, a very direct force right in Scotty's face on the stand. But he said he couldn't have been nicer and always made me feel comfortable and complimented me all the time. But as a little boy, that was a really big scene. So he had to wear this uncomfortable wool jacket. And Lana Turner came up to him and said, "Are you okay? What's going on?" He was having his makeup and he was a little sweaty and just not right. And he had a big scene with all these important lines. And he said that was one of the most nervous he ever was as a young child actor, because he was unflappable. He just really was never nervous. But knowing the importance of that scene, he was a bit. So she said she had some advice for him, which was, listen, I just always think about what I'm hungry for, or my favorite vacation place, or I'm on a beach and I visualize where I want to be. And you're going to be fine. And just that little time that this enormous actress took with him, he remembered almost word by word what she said to him before that scene. And that made a big difference. It's all in Hollywood or on Main Street. It's all of these little touches of a person's life and how they interact with somebody who is perceived at a different level than them, or, having achieved enormous success as they're still climbing the ladder, that made a difference. And, Made in Hollywood, the book, is about so much of that. The icons who came along, that he worked alongside, who had a kind word for him, or a bit of advice, or something to say in a particular moment that really stuck with him. And that's a good lesson, I think, for all of us, to take in our careers and our day-to-day, because when you retell a story like Scotty's and the people that he has worked alongside, that's another point that really stuck out to me. So, Lana Turner had a daughter many years older than Scotty at the time, and got into some trouble with a boyfriend and the daughter.
I remember that story. Yeah.
Yep. But Toby and Scotty always were concerned for her. They knew that there was trouble with, Johnny Stompanato, who was her boyfriend at the time, and his boss was, as we know, a mob boss and underworld king. And they had true concern for her. They couldn't control any aspect of it, but because she had spent some kindness on him, Scotty, they both followed what happened to her. And, they knew her on the inside, not just the outside of Hollywood, but truly on the inside of who she was.
It's so unusual to hear such a positive story about a child actor. It's quite uplifting. And I like that you've taken that route in your storytelling. Now, I know that he did experience some loss. I think his brother died young. His mother died in the 80s. I think there was someone he was deeply involved with, and things didn't work out. Like, how Do you want to tell us a little bit about that? And did you talk about that in the book as well? I'm
We
curious.
did. We brought the book up to basically 2012, and then a note from present day.
Okay.
Scotty lived a particular way, but it doesn't. He was never immune from life, and life can throw some really heavy fireballs at you from time to time. And
Absolutely.
he endured several. So he found the love of his life and didn't have her for very long before she was gone. And there's something in the chapter that we described the loss of his wife, with an element that he had never shared with anybody. So I'll leave that for readers to learn about. But I'll just put it this way: he's never been married since, and he's never been a dad.
Okay.
So his loss was enormous. He lost his mom and he lost Brad almost simultaneously. He experienced Vietnam. He enlisted in the Air Force. He went to serve his country. He had a focus on photography at the time and foresaw for himself the ability to capture war on film. And he was able to do a bit of that. But when your country pivots its needs for you, then you pivot too. So he learned how to detect chemical fallout. He did some time right on the front lines and saw some pretty horrible stuff. And by the time he returned home, it was 4 or 5 years later, and the world was changing. It was early 1970s. He was a young man. When you come back from war, the things you've seen changes you. But he also knew that he had a full life ahead of him. And that's when he was able to pivot into photography. It was just a hobby when he was a little boy. He was fascinated with cinematography. And again, I think the largeness of Hollywood and movie sets and magic, again, I often refer to it as magic because what the actor sees as the production is coming together is all movie magic. It's different from what we'll see in the final product that airs in the movie theater or on TV. But even as they're putting it together, you're exposed to, technological fantasies. And that's what he grew up amongst, the ability to create a different universe and a different landscape and be a different person. So I do think that that's exactly what was so attractive about photography, is capturing a moment in time, but yet putting your spin on it. So he was able to come back and carve out a whole new career for himself and then achieve the highest of successes that he did as a child actor, which, as we talk about, is that happy ending.
Yeah.
But even in the face of tragedy and loss, a career full of integrity and progress and success. But it took a lot of work. It still takes a lot of work. He's still doing what he loves to do, but he's still working.
So he's presently in Sherman Oaks, California. That's correct. Yeah.
Yep, taking jobs for all sorts of projects.
It's unbelievable. It's an amazing story. So, as you were talking about it, I started seeing, like you described earlier, pictures in your head, like when you would read a good book. So while you're talking, I'm thinking, oh my God, I would so see this as a series on Netflix. Are there any, thoughts of perhaps trying to pursue that? Something along those lines?
I think that would be great. I think, the story of Scotty's life is peaks and valleys that everybody might find interesting. The allure of a momager who, she did it in the best sorts of ways. Ultimate protection of her boys and never pushing them beyond their boundaries, but making sure they were prepared for everything they met. All of that done with love. That his dad is a character unto himself. Whatever happened to all the money that he made, and how did
I was going to ask you about that?
Yes,
we hear so many stories about child actors also being exploited by their parents.
Yes.
So he was able to retain that income and
a bit.
Okay.
A bit. So yes, we talk about this in the book too. So his dad Les, he loves his dad Les, but his dad Les was a character for sure. And his mom and dad were busy on their own too. His dad was a professional. He was in the insurance industry. He owned some bowling alleys. He was a mover and shaker. So because he was a mover and shaker, he liked to do some things a little bit faster than others. And he was very involved with the idea of fast money. So he bought a racehorse. He gambled a little bit here and there. And there's a chapter in the book that talks about his brush with the mob. He was looking to lay down a few bets, but you have to know someone who knows someone who knows someone in order to be able to do that. So there's a chapter about his dad getting maybe a little bit too much for his for his comfort level. But Scotty never held any grudges. We'll put it that way. And if there wasn't the sort of money waiting for him when he turned 21 that there could have been, he also is very fond of saying, if I hadn't had my mom and dad behind me, there never would have been any money to begin with. So he didn't come out of it financially fit for life.
Okay.
But he never held any grudges because he never expected to begin with.
It's a wonderful story. I cannot wait to read the book. I did order it this morning. So if our audience members want to order the book, it is available on Amazon. Is that correct?
Yes. Just search it out on Amazon. And for Canadian purposes, too, you can go to your Canadian version and it should be right there.
Amazing. Thank you so very much. I just want to ask one more question.
Yes.
And this is the question of the season. We ask the same question to all our guests. If you could turn back time and talk to your 18-year-old self, what would you tell her?
I would tell her there's going to be there will be tough times and there will be some bumps, but there won't be full falls off the cliff. Stay the course. You're going to be just fine.
I love that. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Esther. What a pleasure.
Yeah, my pleasure as well.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Next week, actually in 2 weeks, June 30th, we will have Stone Love, who's an author as well. And we will be also doing Noon Hour Out of the Box on Wednesday, where we talk about jealousy and how to overcome that. So please stay tuned to both those podcasts. Thank you so much once again, and we'll see you next time. Ciao for now.